Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak. What does it mean to be healthy? There are plenty of well-known diets, constant public debates over healthy eating and living, ads and commercials telling us what's good for us, and cultural influences that shape our perspectives on the matter. All of this can be both helpful and harmful. How does social media play a role in how we see ourselves in society? Whether we're 7, 16, or even 42, we live in a world where self-image and healthy lifestyles are constantly addressed in the media.
What happens when it's children being influenced by what they see and hear in the media? What happens when the pressure and influence comes from an unexpected source, such as sports, beauty pageants, or other activities? Healthy and unhealthy can mean a lot of different things, and today we have Martina Cartwright here to help break it all down for us.
Martina is a registered dietitian and nutrition consultant. She has over 25 years of experience uncovering how our culture's obsession with appearance and perfection affects our mental and physical health. From childhood influences to adult struggles, she's seen how disordered eating patterns take root and how genuine wellness often gets lost in the noise. Hi, Martina. Welcome to the show. It's great to have you on. Could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. My name's Martina Cartwright. I have a PhD in nutritional science and biomolecular chemistry from UW-Madison. I spent 5 glorious years there in the harsh winters and had enough. After that, I moved to Las Vegas, Nevada, where I practiced as a clinical dietitian in both the trauma unit at the University Hospital. But also, I was the first dietitian hired by the Cirque du Soleil, so that was a lot of fun. After I lived in Las Vegas for a little bit, I moved back to Arizona, and I've been living in Scottsdale for about 21 years now, primarily working in the pharmaceutical industry in medical affairs, which is a division that is not involved with sales, but rather disease state education. And I continue to practice as a dietitian. I often speak at national conferences and talk about the role of nutrition throughout the lifespan.
What inspired you to go down this path? What inspired you to study nutrition science?
Well, this is sort of an interesting story because when I was in the 5th grade, my best friend Debbie was absent from school for a little bit, and we didn't know why. And we thought, oh, she just had a cold. It turns out that she was experiencing symptoms of type 1 diabetes, so insulin-dependent diabetes. And after she came back to school, she asked me to be her more of her buddy because when her blood sugar would get too low, somebody had to give her some orange juice. So I had to recognize the signs of low blood sugar and provide her with the orange juice. So that was the impetus for me following a path of nutrition because I was intrigued by the hard sciences, but I was also intrigued with the way that you could help people just with nutrition.
And so, you do work with eating disorders and food psychology. If you could just kind of explain what food psychology is.
So food psychology involves a number of things. It involves people's habits, the culture, and primarily some of the things that they were brought up with. So when you think about comfort foods, that varies by culture. So typically in the Western countries, it's more of like mashed potatoes or some type of comfort food. So that's involved in food psychology. What is somebody's go-to when they're not feeling well or they're feeling down? The other component to that is the relationship with food. So that varies from person to person. And it relates not only to habits, but also flavor preferences, portion size, eating times, all of that is interrelated. But essentially, food psychology is a person's relationship with food and how they incorporate that in their daily life.
On that note, what are some common eating disorders?
So there are some common eating disorders, of course, anorexia nervosa, which is when someone is not eating enough. They have a relationship with food that's rather complicated. It's tied in with weight management and self-esteem. So they're never quite thin enough in their own minds. And that has been recognized for some years. Then we have bulimia, which is an eating disorder in which the person is typically of normal weight, but after they eat, they tend to vomit or try to expel those calories, heavy laxative use, and so forth. And then there's binge eating disorder, another eating disorder that involves individuals that will overeat at certain periods of time, eat lots of calories, and like a bulimic will often expel those calories either through heavy laxative use or through self-induced vomiting. And then lastly, there's an eating disordered pattern, but it's not technically recognized as a true eating disorder, called orthorexia nervosa, which is a term used when people become obsessed with what they consider to be healthy eating. So extreme eating habits, as an example, it would be an individual who is obsessed with eating only organic everything and fruits and vegetables to the point where it interferes in their normal life.
How do you balance translating complex research into practical advice for the public?
That's always a challenge because it depends on the research study and what are some of the key components of that study. So typically when I look at a research study, I'm examining how well the study was designed in terms of patients, or if they're doing an experiment, how well it was designed under basic science tenets. And then look at how the experiment or the study was conducted and the conclusions that are drawn. As with any discipline, there is bias in science, and that's something that statistics help kind of weigh out. But it can be very complicated when you have a number of studies with similar patient populations doing similar things, but you get very different results. So you have to ask yourself, what are the whys behind that? So in terms of explaining that to the general public, it's important to use terms that are used every day, not to downplay it, but to look at what people talk about on a daily basis, and then talk about how it might apply to them. So as an example of that, when we look at most of the studies that have been done with heart disease, for example, most of them have been done in male patients. So it may not necessarily apply to females. So it's things like that where we have to evaluate. In nutrition, it's very complicated because, as you may see on the news, you just see the highlights of, one day carrots are bad for you. The next day carrots are fabulous for you. So it comes from different research and how it's interpreted. So part of my job as a scientist is to critically evaluate the literature and then bring it home to the person that's in that audience that wants to know, how does this apply to me?
And I'm sure that's partly why there's so many misconceptions and myths about weight loss and dieting. But what are some of the biggest ones that you've seen that you really just need people to know that this is not true?
So there's so many myths about nutrition. This has exploded with the internet, where everybody's become a nutrition expert, so to speak, because they just read one little bit of information, or they've taken a class. I had a neighbor that did this. I just took a weekend class and I'm a nutritionist like you. I said, no, I spent 4 years in college and have a minor in chemistry and went through the testing process. So when people speak of nutrition, it's usually, I'm going to tell you what to eat and the supplements to use. So it gets to be a little bit more complicated. But when we look at the paradigm of nutrition and how it's translated, everybody eats. So therefore, everybody thinks that they're an expert in one way or another. The most common myths that we see are primarily related to weight loss, supplements. We also see a little bit around eating patterns. So for example, if somebody is trying to lose weight, we've learned that just cutting calories isn't the be-all, end-all. Everybody's metabolism is different. But remember, that person's trying to sell a diet book or some other thing. We also see that with alternative medicine practices, and some of them are great, yet some of them are not bound in science. So you don't want to give people false hope either. So as far as some of the top 10 myths, calories, reducing calories always equals weight loss, not true. Certain diets that are heavy in protein will help you lose weight. That may be true temporarily, but it's not all about losing weight. So if you're looking for an anti-inflammatory meal plan, it's something more along the lines of a Mediterranean diet that's rich in fruits and vegetables. So it's helping find that balance. But diets have been around forever. I actually have a book that was published in the late 1800s. I found it at a thrift store called Eating to Live Long. Chapter 12 is about the evils of fruit, that women that ate too much fruit will likely get a divorce. That was based on science back in the day. And it talks about a high protein diet and many other interesting things. But crazy diets have been with us for a long time. We have no idea how far back they go. But again, women back in the early 1900s used to swallow tapeworms to lose weight. There's a lot of weird stuff out there.
I mean, I remember my grandmother's favorite cereal was cornflakes. And then I remember like how that even developed. And I always thought that was weird.
Yes, with the cornflakes, it developed at a health farm. It's interesting how some of these foods develop and what the impetus was for the development of certain foods or even certain beverages and things like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of like healthy beverages that have come out recently, like, you know, healthy sodas and things. And it's really interesting to see like people gravitate towards those because there's just the perception that it's healthy without really reading ingredients or why it's considered healthy.
There's a name for that. It's called a health halo. So you hit on something important. So the health halo is people believe that the term automatically conveys healthfulness. So plant burgers are a good example. They can be loaded with sodium. They're highly processed, but because they're plant-based, they're healthy. Or those veggie sticks that you've seen that are in the potato chip aisle. Oh, they're veggie, so it must be good. So that's the health halo. You hit on a very good point there.
Well, I do like veggie sticks, but yeah, I don't eat them that often. I still see them as like a snack, just like chips in the chip aisle. My mother always said, like, if it's in the snack aisle, it's a snack. It's there for a reason. I guess that kind of brings us to, like we're talking about people pushing, these healthy products or things like that. And obviously social media is a big thing. It's been a big thing for a while. And there's plenty of people on there. I'm on TikTok, I'm on Instagram, and you see people who are like, follow this diet or eat this, don't drink that. So how does society and the media influence eating disorders?
I think that the most interesting thing that I've seen as far as media and eating disorders goes back some years. And this is even before social media started. If you look at some of the magazines at any point in time, the women are typically Caucasian, very skinny. That was the role model. If you think about the supermodels of the 80s, they set the tone of expectation back then, designer clothes, being skinny, looking a certain way. And that was the idea, the beauty ideal in their mind. And people try to mimic that, both men and women to some degree, but mostly women. And if they're not able to achieve what they consider to be the beauty ideal for their culture, for some, that can lead to body dissatisfaction that persists not only in childhood and the teenage years, but also into adulthood. And that, for some, can lead to eating disorders. So, for example, I was at this conference, it was a dermatology conference, and I met with this woman who was probably in her early 80s. And she was like a size 2. And somebody said to me, she's so very proud that she can still fit in her clothes that she wore in high school. And that was her thing, is that she still wanted to have that body shape that she had when she was a teenager. And as we know, as we get older, hormones change, our body shape changes. Your body doesn't respond the same way it did as a teenager, nor should it as an adult woman. But it was one of those things, and she was so incredibly frail. And that's one of the things that we see with long-term eating disordered eating patterns, and body dissatisfaction that's managed through eating is frailty. And this happened to a friend of mine as well. She had an eating disorder when we were in college, gave birth to her son, and passed away not long after that because it was such a strain on her heart. So it's more than just what you can see on the outside, but also on the inside. But the media was the primary driving factor in some of these cases, not all of them, to try and mimic what a model looks like, what their idea of beauty is. And again, that differs for every culture. Some cultures and ethnicities are much more involved with different body shapes and accepting of different body shapes versus others. But right now, what we're seeing as a trend online, and notice how clothing has changed a little bit in the last few years, where it's a lot of tight spandex, a lot of bearing of the midriff, and so forth. And there's this idea of body positivity, which I think is great, but we also need to look at being fit and healthy, whatever that means. And that doesn't necessarily mean a size 2, but it does mean maintaining some activity, because again, the body changes over time. So when you asked about the media, it has an enormous influence primarily on adolescents, because that's when they're developing and coming into their own. But that can persist into adulthood and even obviously into older age.
It's everywhere, right? And like how media, it's not always so explicit anymore. Like it's maybe not just TV ads, but I don't know, they call it, is it cause marketing, where it's subtle?
I mean, it's whatever whatever. I mean, it's an activity that you like to do, but it doesn't mean that you're doing it because you're trying to be skinny or, you know what I mean? Like you like it.
That goes back to an excellent point about fitness versus fatness, so to speak. So, for example, I'm a swimmer. My shoulders are huge. I have broad shoulders. The activities that you choose to do dictate, in some respects, what type of body shape you're going to have. And again, that changes over time. So it's one of those things that we instruct about with adolescents and young girls in particular, but we're also seeing more eating disorders among men as well. If you pick up fashion magazines now, you'll see both men and women posing. Typically, they're very thin. The camera does add some weight. Now we have the advantage of having airbrushing now that we didn't have back in the day. So those pictures look even more perfect. And I work in the dermatology field right now. There are many ways to make somebody's skin look fabulous using AI or other technology, and people think that they can achieve that. And it's an impossible goal. What they're seeing is not real in most cases. It is not real. White teeth is another one. Everybody wants white teeth. Well, a lot of those teeth are veneers, or they've been bleached to the point of pain, or for photographs, they've been enhanced. And teenagers and adolescents don't understand that it's a mind game, really.
The more materialistic a culture is, you place a lot more value on how something looks or someone looks. Child beauty pageants used to be a big thing. And, the show Toddlers and Tiaras on TLC, it seems like, they're not as big of a deal as they used to be. So why do you think that is?
I think people have just stopped watching it. So back in 2012, I published an article in a peer-reviewed medical journal about toddlers and tiaras, essentially, about child pageants, what causes a parent to put a child into a beauty pageant and what they hope to expect. And a lot of it is driven by the parent and their desire for fame or making money or whatever. You get a lot of stage moms involved in that, and stage dads too, frankly, in some cases. And these little kids would be dressed up in fancy clothes and wigs and spray tans when they're 3 years old, and makeup and all of it. And they looked like little adults. I mean, think about John Benet Ramsey. If it's a hobby, it's okay. But if it's a lifestyle, that's when it really pushes the kid over the edge in some cases, with the stress and the performance and all of that. And I think one of the reasons why Toddlers and Tiaras went out of vogue is because people started recognizing some of the damage psychologically it was doing to some of the kids. Not all of them. I've spoken with some of them who are now adults, and they're very well adjusted and have happy careers as newscasters and so forth. But there are others that continue to experience body dissatisfaction. One of them that we've seen online recently is Honey Boo Boo. I believe that she's in her probably 20 years old now. And she does have a weight management issue that she's talked about. But when you look at her family, that's just their body type. And that's the way it is. But when she was a pageant contestant, you saw how this would just go overboard. They give these kids caffeine and sugar to keep them on point and engaged for a while. And then once the pageant is over, then they kind of decompress. But I did see that. I saw a lot of caffeine use in toddlers, a lot of sugar, No naps. It was all about the performance. And for what? In hopes of being famous. So I think toddlers and tiaras went by the wayside because people started recognizing that this was not healthy. And then they moved on to something else.
Why do, I guess, adults or parents put their children through this? Like, what makes them say, you know what, I'm going to put my kid into child pageants? How does that even get started in that process? And what's the catalyst? What forces them to do that?
So there's a phenomenon known as achievement by proxy. And the title of my article was Princess by Proxy. So it typically starts out as a hobby. And perhaps mom or dad is looking for attention. And it's typically driven by the female parent or the grandparent in some cases, where the child is so beautiful, they want everybody to see that child. And then they start dressing them up and going to pageants and getting more attention, more positive attention. And it's really about the moms in many cases. They want that attention. Then they get a little bit of attention and it starts to escalate for some, where they're taking out a mortgage on their house. They can't afford things because they're buying dresses and traveling. And I experienced this when I observed one of the toddlers and tiaras filming. A woman I talked to, her little girl was just beautiful. And she said, I don't think she's going to win in her off-the-rack dress, but I just want her to have time to be on camera because I think she's so beautiful. And my husband's a police officer and I'm a waitress. And we spent a lot of money to get her here to just have time on television. And when I saw the final cut of the program, that child wasn't even featured. I mean, just barely. So nobody's going to notice her. She's not going to be discovered. But it starts to escalate to that point, and then it gets to the level of the child is the primary moneymaker. The child is delivering that to the parent, not only from an attention standpoint, but also from a money-making standpoint. So it's a lot like a stage mother. And there's an excellent book by Melissa Francis. She used to be on Little House on the Prairie back in the 70s and 80s. And she wrote a book called Diary of a Stage Mother's Daughter. And it talks about how she and her sister were essentially used to make money for the parent, and that the mom was only happy when they were performing and getting attention. And they worked those girls to the point where Melissa became estranged from her mother. And it was a fascinating story, but you see that a lot, whether it's pageants or some cases sporting events. They want their kid to be the next Tiger Woods, so they spend all this money on golf lessons, and the kid may not be interested in golf. So that's my long answer to your short question about what is driving it. And for many, it's the parent sees the kid as a moneymaker and as an attention getter, and that feeds their ego and lifts them without considering the child as a separate person.
I was going to mention even acting in sports, but yeah, you touched on it because I didn't even think about, I mean, I think everybody knows about the acting, the child actors, but sports, I think it's a little bit more normalized because I think it's even like on just a basic, like middle class, America, like level, like, there's plenty of parents who do that.
There are, and you see them get out of control at some of the games now. We're starting to see more of that. Or their kid can do no wrong, or their kid is pushed so much to be successful that they do things that may not be how they would normally behave because of this competition. So you do see a lot of that. I mean, think about even Tanya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan and how that all came about. It was all about the competition. I'm just going to get rid of my competition so I can be number one, and I'm ego-driven. And again, that started out at a very young age. So win no matter what.
Yeah, and probably like, I'm not going to be loved by my mom or my dad if I'm not number one. It's like conditional. Interesting about the acting, well, and also just the sports, but I started watching a show called Running Point, and it's a comedy about a basketball family. And they say something which I don't know how true it is, but it seemed like it was a known fact that everybody knows, that male basketball players and their moms have some of the most codependent. They normalize it as saying my mom's like sacrificed single moms, who worked like 3 jobs to get me to this place.
It's just a game, but they don't view it as a game. And we can see examples like this throughout our lives. Even back when I was in high school, we had this amazing running back on our high school team, and it was a small school. Very talented, good-looking guy. And I remember thinking, I wonder how his future is going to turn out, because he had a full ride scholarship to a private college. And about 6 weeks before school was supposed to start, he picked a fight with some kid, beat this guy up pretty badly, got his college scholarship revoked. And I thought, why would somebody go on such a rapid downward spiral? And what a lot of people don't understand as children, but we do as adults now, is that these kids are not filled with life skills. Their being is based on what you said earlier, the identity with the sport and the pleasing of the parent. And when they get stressed out and can't handle it, then they're going to do something drastic to pull themselves out. And this is part of the psychology of all of that, is that we see that with some, where they just can't hack life. I mean, they get to the point where I was a successful athlete, now what am I going to do? And we even see that with professional athletes. I have some concerns about the young woman who was I believe she was at LSU, the gymnast that's been so popular in social media. She has an injury now. Is it recoverable? I don't know. And then what is she going to do? Because her entire identity is based on that skill set and activity and her success at doing it. And to your point earlier about injuries, we're starting to see more Tommy John surgeries for young pitchers at younger ages because they're just burning these kids out. And they're telling them to plow through the injuries. And those last a lifetime for some.
Yeah, sports culture is very, I guess complicated, partly toxic. It's a lot of things.
And there's a weight component to all of that too. When you think about gymnasts or wrestlers or even boxers that have to have a weigh-in, that can also develop into an unhealthy relationship with food. We see that dancers, another type of thing, is that in order to maintain that weight, they have to restrict food or exercise more. And muscle takes up less space and weighs more than fat. So you could have somebody that is unsuccessful with their weigh-in, but they're very muscular. It throws everything off. We have such a weird idea of what fitness is in this country in particular and what that looks like. That weight is just one component. And I tell people, ignore the scale. It's how your clothes fit. And your body will change as you get older because of hormones. That's just the way it goes. I'm not the same size as I was when I was 15.
And how does that relationship with food affect these child pageant participants later in life? How does it affect their relationship with food and body image later in life because they're exposed to it at such a young age?
It really depends on how it's perceived. So, for example, with some kids that are in these pageants, they know that this is just a pageant thing. I'm going to eat weird on the weekend in order to maintain my pageant, and then it'll be back to normal, like any other activity. I did have a friend, though, Karen Cataline. She wrote a book called Fat Lash, and she was a child pageant participant back in the 60s. And as an example, for one of her birthdays, her mom said, you can have one bite of cake, and that's it, because she wanted her daughter to be so skinny. And then when she became a teenager, she ballooned to over 200 pounds because she was eating everything. She was so restricted as a child that she was not only rebelling, but also she was probably pretty hungry to get back to her weight. And you see that sometimes where this is a rebellion rebound effect for some kids that have been restricted during their early years, where they just have this unhealthy relationship for food because, first of all, they don't know what to eat. And secondly, they don't know how to manage hunger and satiety signals that they may be receiving. Every child is born with the ability to eat until they're full or satisfied and then turn away. And then once the parents get involved, good or bad, those mechanisms get thrown off, typically in toddlerhood, where food is used as a reward on a regular basis, not every once in a while. But there are certain things, or fat talk. You know, I don't want my kid to eat because I think they're getting fat. I've heard people say that about toddlers. It's like, that's a 3-year-old. So unless they're out of the norm, and the norm is pretty big, and you have to look at the parent's body size, then you're going off the rails here. Children are not meant to look like adults. They're children. They need body fat for growth and development. And bad things will happen if it's not there. So it's sort of that healthy relationship with food. And as we talked about earlier, it's harder and harder to discern what that actually is with all the stuff in the media and all the things that are going on as far as body satisfaction and images that people see on a regular basis.
We were talking about beauty pageants and sports and child actors and like, their perception of self-worth and all that. But I mean, you mentioned some too, but are there any other like long-term psychological effects of growing up in the environment? Like, where you prioritize appearance over substance?
So I can give you a couple of examples of that. I know somebody who was a professional bodybuilder in her younger days, and she's close to 60 now. And she still looks beautiful, but she's getting a lot of Botox and fillers and is very concerned about her appearance and focuses on certain eating patterns. But it's all about the way that she looks because she views this as staying young. And again, very beautiful person. But I see things in her that are not necessarily healthy, that she became a bodybuilder for all the attention it gave her and the discipline and all of that. And those are good things if they're managed well. But there's a lack of acceptance of getting older. And I think for women, it's a little bit more difficult too, getting older if you're on television, because for men, they look distinguished. For women, they look old. And that's always been there. But this relationship can continue even into adulthood. And I think it's more prevalent now than it has been in our grandparents' generation, because we have been exposed to images over our lifetime on a daily basis, whereas they were not. So they saw some of it, but not to the degree that we're seeing it now, or the impact of social media and what is the norm.
And how does perfection play into all of this? Like, how does that affect self-esteem?
So there are certain personality traits that are associated with eating disorders. Among them is this idea of perfectionism. We see that with a lot of the rexias, orthorexia, anorexia, where it's this perfectionist tendency to be perfect at everything. And if they're not perfect, then they punish themselves in some way. So when you think about somebody with anorexia, the one thing that they can control is what they eat or don't eat. So if their lives are out of control in whatever paradigm they have, that is one way that they can control it. You also have this issue of depression to some degree, body dissatisfaction. They're all rolled in there with obsessive compulsive disorder for some. Some of the anorexic that I've worked with would track all their calories, weigh all their food, weigh their stool. They wanted to expel as much as they took in weight-wise. It got to be that extreme. We had a male anorexic who was hiding food in his shoes and everything else in the hospital until we had to transfer him to another unit because he was clearly anorexic. I've had a woman who was blind because of her diabetes, and that's the other interesting thing. Back in the day, and maybe it's still true today, some diabetics would abuse their insulin. They wouldn't take it in order to remain very skinny. If a diabetic who's requiring insulin takes less insulin, they'll expel that sugar through their kidneys. Now, they may end up being blind and having kidney problems, but at least they'll be thin. That's sort of in their mind. And this woman was legally blind and was practicing bulimic habits, even though she couldn't see herself. So that just relates sort of the psychology of all of that. That was one of the strangest cases I've ever seen. So I think the key takeaway here is that a lot of this is a mental issue. There are treatments now for OCD and this idea of perfectionism, but it's really hard to get people that have that ingrained as a child out of their system because their expectations are much higher. And people want to be very kind and say, well, of course you did this. Of course you did that. Of course you're being successful. That it puts extra pressure on them if they have these perfectionist tendencies, that failure of whatever is not acceptable and they're very hard on themselves. And we all go through periods like that. And people are meant to be encouraging, but in some respects, it puts too much pressure because if they fail, then it's like, oh, well, you failed. Well, failure is part of life. So it makes you stronger and more successful. Not every experiment is going to be successful in the laboratory. That's just the way it is. You learn from that and you move on. The same goes with anything else. And I think the key takeaway here is that if you're a parent or a caregiver, you encourage your children in a healthful manner. You don't do fat talk. you accept the child, and you talk about fitness rather than fatness, whatever that looks like. And balance and proportion are also key. And the other thing that we haven't talked about is economics of all of this, because someone of a higher economic stature is usually a person that suffers from anorexia or orthorexia because they have the luxury of that, so to speak, where somebody of a lower economic status, they may be hungry. Food to them is survival, whereas food to others is control. Does that kind of resonate with some of the things that you've seen as well?
I can, think of the difference. Like, I've had friends who, I grew up fairly middle class, so, I have the friends who had a couple of them, anorexia. One, we did not know until it was a problem that she was bulimic. But then I've also seen the kids who, they didn't really have their refrigerator wasn't full. They didn't have access to super healthy food. So yeah, when they see it, when they're around it. So Chandi, I don't know what your experience has been.
Well, I just know about in the cultural aspect, some cultures being, well, I guess for us, we would consider overweight is actually seen as a positive thing because it signifies wealth.
Well, and you can see that throughout history. If you look at some of the paintings of kings and queens back in the day, they were a little bit heavier, and they tend to have very pale white skin because being a darker toned skin meant that you were a laborer and that you worked outside. So it was considered to be not great. So a lot of the aristocracy back in the day would be a bit overweight because, to your point, it was a sign of wealth, and that they weren't outside laboring in the fields because they were inside and covered up. It's strange how some of those dynamics change over time. It could be about anything. And when you're working with children, you've got to caution them about trends as well, and make them feel more comfortable with who they are. I have naturally curly hair, and you wouldn't believe the number of people who've said, well, you just need to straighten it. It'll look better that way. And I said, no, thanks. I'm happy the way it is. It will look as it looks when it does what it does. Chemical straighteners are not healthy for your scalp or your hair or your long-term management. So suck it up. This is who I am. But you have to have that confidence relayed by an authority figure, a parent, a teacher, someone, and you have to have that strength to push back on whatever societal norms are at the time. Now curly hair is in, and everybody's like, oh, look at that. So that could be about anything. It could be about wearing glasses. They wanted people to wear contacts all the time because glasses meant that you were a nerd, and that wasn't a great thing. And here we are all wearing glasses. And we look fabulous. So that's the point, is that kids have to be resilient against what the norms are because trends change over time. They just do. And we're not going to put up with a lot of this anymore. I was saying earlier that I was at a conference with 21,000 people. And what we've learned over time, especially after COVID, those of us that used to wear maybe a little bit of a heel are not doing that anymore. We're wearing comfortable shoes because they're comfortable. Some of the younger ones that were there were like, oh, the first day I wore heels and my feet are killing me, and now I'm wearing flip-flops. They said, I see why everybody's doing that. I said, those things are torture devices if you're walking 12,000 steps a day back and forth. Don't do it. Nobody cares. If somebody's looking at your feet and they're making those kind of comments, they've got other issues. So move on. So it's those types of things, though, that it's finding that comfort for that person so they are comfortable in themselves, which will last a lifetime.
Some juicy stuff, well, that you can talk about. What are some of the darkest things or darker things you've seen when working with child pageants or even other industries?
There's a lot of weird stuff out there. So when I was at a filming of Toddlers and Tiaras in Las Vegas, it was very difficult to find out where the event was being held, which already raises a couple red flags. In some ways, I mean, to some degree, I think they wanted to keep it quiet because they didn't want a lot of people in there. So I purchased my ticket. I get there and I'm sitting there, and they asked what I was doing there because I didn't have a child. And I said, oh, I'm considering allowing my child in. And my friend came with me with her daughter to work through that. So I'm sitting there and I'm looking at these kids. And in the front row, I see an older man by himself looking at these young girls in a way that was frankly creepy. And I thought, I'm going to keep my eye on that guy, because at this point, everybody's a mom or a dad, and you have to protect kids. I mean, this guy was clearly, no normal adult male looks at a child the way he was looking at them. As women, we all know what that creep look is. And that was weird. One of the children, a 6-year-old that was featured in the program, the father was the custodial parent, which stunned me. And he had a T-shirt on of a stripper, a silhouette of a stripper on a pole that said, "I support single moms." And he's the custodial parent of the 6-year-old that's performing. Creepy.
Yeah, that's disturbing.
The other thing was that the judges there were all drag queens dressed in their outfits. And I've got no issue with that if they want to do that as adults. That's an adult thing. But the children were very confused by that. And one little girl thought they meant dry cleaner instead of drag queen, and they all thought that was funny. And I said, that's sexualizing a child. And they were dressed like Cher in the skimpy outfit. So that was another weird thing. As far as some of the entertainers I've worked with, I've seen eating disorders, I've seen vitamin deficiencies, I've seen struggles with weight management to the point of obsession. If they get kicked out of being in the program, they get sent back to their home country. And again, this is a program that's not owned by a United States company. It's owned by another country where the rules and regulations are not the same. They're considered to be independent contractors, so they don't have to have workman's comp insurance if they get injured. And these are younger kids. I've seen a lot of creepy things. And for what? I mean, you see that in the modeling world too, or in acting, how some women were treated as objects rather than as people. But it puts both boys and girls in very vulnerable positions. I mean, frankly, I'll just bring up the Sean Diddy Combs issue with these young women and boys that were around him. And I think we're starting to see, as some of these kids have grown into adulthood, some of the psychological issues that are starting to come out because of the trauma that they experienced, perhaps under his hands. And we can't assume guilt until he's proven guilty, but we've all seen that in the news. It's abuse of all types as children manifests in adulthood in some way, shape, or form. I've seen a lot of weird stuff. And living in Las Vegas was another interesting thing. You see a lot of people that come there to be the next dancer, the next whatever. And it's like Hollywood dreams that get smashed, and then things happen. And it's, oh, if I was only skinny enough, if only I had breast implants, if only I had extensions in my hair, if only, and they spend all this money getting that done without any satisfaction.
You know, it's sad to know that kids are being put in these situations and that, they don't know any better. They don't, what are they going to do? It's a child. The adults are supposed to protect them. Yet, you're sexualizing children, exposing them to all different kinds of situations that be harmful and negative. I mean, it kind of just goes to show it's really not about the kids. It's about the adults.
And it varies by country. I think what was interesting when I was working on child beauty pageants is I think the average age of a Vogue model in France at the time was like 13 or 14. And so here in the United States, that would not be tolerated. That's essentially child labor. Over there, they make these young girls who are at their prime physicality, so to speak, and they're coming into their womanhood physically as what the beauty ideal is. And they had a 12-year-old, I think, on the cover of Vogue back in 2012 or something. It's like, that is a child. So it's that sort of different type of cultural norm, whatever that looks like, good or bad. There are some cultures that have a very healthy attitude about body size and what fitness is and being comfortable in your own personhood.
It seems like diet culture is everywhere. It's infiltrated in our society. Well, it's happening in childhood too. So, what are some signs do you think that people can look out for, especially parents, to make sure that, they're ensuring and fostering a healthy relationship of food for their kids?
When you look at food patterns throughout the lifespan, there are some key milestones, and then there are some red flags. So what I mean by that is that for infants, they're exclusively breastfed or formula fed until they're about 6 months, and then you start introducing semi-solid food, baby food. And they will eat until they're full or satisfied. If you've ever fed an infant, you know that once they're done eating, they'll turn away and they'll stop. parents need to pay attention to that. That's the signal to stop. Do not force feed the child. They're done. And when they're hungry again, they'll let you know. Move on. In toddlerhood, that signaling kind of goes away because it's influenced by other things. So using food all the time as a reward. They'll go on food jags where peanut butter and jelly sandwiches are great every hour of every day until they're not. That's okay. That's normal for kids. For some kids, there's a texture issue. So autistic kids may not like the texture of some foods, and that has to be recognized, and you try to formulate a better meal plan. You also have to look out for food allergies and things like that. But consistency is the key. The idea is to introduce portion sizes that are appropriate for that child, that sweets should also be given, but not all the time. You want to limit, but not eliminate, because elimination means, oh, it's bad, so therefore it must be good for me. And it's about, again, reasonable portions. Think about how wonky that gets if you're trying to feed your kid an adult-sized portion. Then they're going to have that ingrained in their head about, this is what this looks like for me at an early age. So that's critical. And then whenever possible, and I know they're making some changes, in my opinion, that are good in the school lunch program to get rid of some of the junk that's provided to kids, because for some kids, that is the really only real meal of the day. So introducing more choices that may be more healthful for them and reasonable portion sizes so they don't go hungry, but they have that flavor profile. And sending your kid to school with lunch if you can, being mindful of what they're eating. And of course, they're going to eat junk food because that's what kids do. But equipping them with the ability to make good choices and showing the relationship between being healthy and strong and physically fit in their own way versus having a bad relationship with food. And that's really important in those teen years, because that's when they will start developing some independence where they're on their own. And if you say, okay, you had a Big Mac tonight, all right, great, but what are you going to do the rest of the night? And you eat too many of those, then you may have a fitness issue. You see what I mean? It's that relationship right there that carries over into adulthood. So we do see that throughout the lifespan. It's just paying attention to that positive reinforcement, encouraging them to try new foods in new ways, focusing on fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, and little tips like keeping a bowl of fruit out of sight, out of mind. What is available? When the kid comes home from school, okay, maybe they can have a little piece of chocolate, but they also need to have an apple or something like that, or carrots or something else that they enjoy. And as they're growing, children will sleep a lot because growth hormone is released during sleep. So that's normal. And then when they get up, especially if you have a teenage boy, they're going to be ravenous. So being able to provide a variety of different snacks for them to select and really staying away from those energy drinks. That is the bane of my existence for kids like that.
You know, one thing you said, some kids, like lunch at school is maybe like the only real meal they get. I never even thought about that before. It's never crossed my mind.
It's frequent for kids in economically disadvantaged areas. They may have a breakfast program, but really it's lunch that delivers. And you think about that and it's like, okay, what would I want my kid to eat for lunch? And the school lunch program has its merits, but I think that children need to be offered, for some, even more food at lunch and a better variety of choice so they can try different foods and incorporate them, but also get enough calories to meet their needs. Because when they go home, they may have a single parent household where they're a latchkey kid when they're 8 and there's nothing at home to eat, or they don't know how to fix the food. So it's so important to recognize that there may be judgment about some of these programs and they're not necessarily the best, but sometimes that's all they have to offer to these kids, and we could do better. We want them to eat as healthfully as people with money eat, frankly. And that means giving them the ability to discern what is a healthy portion size, what is a healthier food choice, and frankly, what can provide enough nourishment for them if that's really their only meal of the day.
You mentioned girls as young as 4 express concerns about body size. How can we counteract these damaging messages before they take root?
I think for younger kids, particularly toddlers, they're heavily influenced by their parent. So positive self-talk, not restricting, not saying things like, oh, that food is fattening. I mean, that's going to ingrain the child with, oh, that food is fattening. What does that mean? And limiting their exposure to images in the media at that point. They should not be viewing magazines or online content that is so focused on beauty and physicality. It should be focused more on, again, the idea of driving fitness and what we call everyday activities. I mean, encourage them to walk and play and do things. There's an ad by Dove right now where they show this little girl, she's about 3, she's running. And she's so cute. And they said, most women develop poor body image by the time they're adult and a lack of participation in athletics. We need to encourage our kids, males or females, to be active and also to cut down on those fat images of that's beautiful or that's handsome. And if you don't look like that, they're going to ingrain that, then I'm not. So really restricting the images. I mean, think about when we grew up, and I'm older than you two, but I remember that we sat down to the table to eat. We didn't have enormous portion sizes. We may not have had a lot of money, but we had food on the table and we were very active. We were told to go outside and play. And we did. I think those messages are very important for kids to hear, is more positive rather than negative, that food is part of nourishment. And that's the key. It nourishes and supports the body. And I think we've lost track of that for some.
For some kids, the lunch meal at school is the main meal or only meal that they would get. So kids spend a lot of time in school. So what do you think that schools can do to promote body positivity, or even if not promoting body positivity, but counteracting the negative body image like ideals that we hear about?
So back in the day, we used to have health class, and there used to be physical fitness and health class and things like that. Now it's biology or whatever. I think it would be helpful if kids were exposed to positive messages, particularly wherever they eat their lunch, to talk about food as nourishment. Now, keep in mind, though, that some kids will bring their lunch to school, and it may not be as healthful as what you'd like it to be. And we've actually had kids, which I think is wrong, take their lunch to school, and the teacher will go through it and say, that's not healthy, and start throwing things out. That is true. Mind your business. So the kid is being nourished in the best way that the parent knows how. It may not be your ideal, but that's what the kid is going to eat. And a couple of teachers threw out this kid's entire lunch because he had chicken fingers and something else. That's not up for them to decide. But what you can say is that while they're eating their meal, this is your nourishment. This contains vitamins and minerals and protein, fat, and carbohydrate, and all these wonderful things to help make you healthy and help sustain you. Eating breakfast helps you learn more. And so not so much to make judgments on the type of food that's provided, because again, we have to be aware that people are in their own situation, but to make them aware of the contents of food. And that sometimes will drive questions. Well, which foods have more carbohydrate? What is a carbohydrate? Some foods have more protein. What does that mean? All of that, I think, would play an important role in education in schools to teach the children, particularly at an early age, of the merits of the food. We did a program like that years ago in Tucson. We called it Meals for Millions, where we went into economically disadvantaged areas of Tucson and provided soil and seeds to kids in 1st through the 3rd grade, where they would grow culturally appropriate foods. So what I mean by that, it was a large Hispanic population. We taught them how to grow tomatoes, peppers, and other foods and herbs that they would use. And when we looked at them several years later, they still ate more fruits and vegetables because they were able to see where it came from. And they knew what nutrients were provided by those vegetables and herbs and fruits that were grown. So even something as simple as that makes a difference, because the child will remember. And if we're really trying to make America healthy again, it starts with a seed. And they have to know where their food comes from and how they can incorporate it, and to eat more whole foods rather than more junk. A little bit of junk is okay, just not all the time, if you can afford it. And that's the other key.
I mean, you're bringing up a lot of points that I didn't think about it. Like, we had a garden when I was growing up, so we grew a lot of fruits and vegetables. It wasn't a big thing. Like, I saw it. I was always totally fine with eating vegetables. I had some friends who were not. They didn't like them. Like, how do you not like this? Obviously, as they've gotten older, they're like, okay, I know I need to eat it. Like, but I just like it. It's a different experience, I guess. And Shanti, I know you're the whole like gardening thing, and I know your dad is really into it.
Yeah, and somebody I spoke to talked about it, that for them, gardening, and it's kind of punny and ironic, but it's really like food for the soul.
It makes you appreciate more as well, because not every plant's going to grow. So there's going to be some failure involved, which is a good life lesson. I've had stuff that didn't grow at all. I'm like, wow, I wonder what happened. But it teaches temperature and sunlight and water and seeds and all of those things that go into making a plant do what it does.
And when kids don't see that, especially if they're eating, they might have vegetables that might come out of a jar or a can, and they're not seeing it. Might get frozen vegetables or whatever it is. Even meat, things like they haven't seen their grandmother kill dinner. It's a different experience. I think you have a different relationship with food.
Now, it's important to know where it comes from. I mean, my husband grew up in New York City, so there was no gardening, there were no plants, and fortunately, his family was from Puerto Rico, so he had an opportunity to see how things grow there. And like you said, kill the chicken at home, and that's what you're having for dinner. But it took him a while to visit his family there. So some of the dietary habits he grew up with were lacking some fruits and vegetables, because that's just not what was his experience based on where he grew up in the city, where there are no gardens. I mean, there are urban gardens. There's the opportunity due to hydroponics too. I mean, yeah.
It's still different though. It's still a different experience. I remember I went to college in Newark here in New Jersey, and, you have the kids come by the university and, you teach them about how you grow things. There's programs where elementary, middle school kids go, and like we kind of show them how to grow things and do things, and it's fun. But it's still not the same as like them going to a farm and seeing like just fields of corn or tomato. Like just, it's good for kids to even just understand like this is like farm to table. It was grown there. It went to this other place. It was processed even. And then now we put it in a jar for you. Like it's still what you're eating. This is where it came from specifically. This is how it was made. And I think that might change people's thoughts on it too. But the other thing I think I've mentioned to Chandi at some point is some foods are just inherently more expensive at this point too, to obtain. What's cheaper is the stuff that is in a can, that is frozen. That's, the fresh stuff it's more expensive. And some families may not be able to afford the fresh fruits and vegetables.
Absolutely. And those are high risk for somebody of low income. Perishable foods are a high risk item because bananas go bad, produce goes bad. I mean, think about how many times we've had to throw out produce because we think we're going to use it and then we don't use it in time. For us, we have the luxury of being able to repurchase. For somebody that's looking at every dollar, that is not an advantage. So as a dietitian, when we are counseling somebody of a lower economic ability, fresh is great. Frozen is almost as good. Frozen fruits and vegetables that have nothing else added to them, that are flash frozen, are just as nutrient dense, if not more so, as fresh. And they can be budgeted in and used as they need versus just throwing it out when it loses its freshness. Canned is okay, but it typically has more salt and more water and all of that. So store brand frozen is typically the way that we go, and then talk about portioning it out, because we want people to eat fresh fruits and vegetables. But if you don't have a lot of money, that is extremely high risk and not very nutrient dense. When you have one main meal to feed your kids a day, it's probably not going to be organic fruits and vegetables. So it's those types of things. We look at lower cost items. So potatoes are an example. A lot of people think that potatoes are bad, but a whole potato, a baked potato that you can put in the microwave, has quite a bit of vitamin C. It's got fiber. It's got plenty of potassium. So it's just the stuff that you put on it that makes it, quote, bad or higher in calories. But again, if you're looking at the economics of the situation and the nutrient density, those are all things that we have to keep in mind. And I think a lot of that is lacking on social media and other places, is that this idea of assuming that everybody has the economic capability of eating, quote, healthfully. And they may be selecting foods that are available that are inexpensive and calorically dense, but have all kinds of, excuse my language, crap in them that hopefully will be taken out and that will go back to the way things had been, which are using, if you're going to have a cookie, then you're going to use wheat and not high fructose corn syrup. You're going to use sugar. You're going to take those dyes out. Yes, is it still a cookie? Of course, but it's going to be a bit more healthful than something else. So that's the key thing.
The way things are going when it comes to like FDA and food these days is interesting. I'm really curious to see what's going to happen. I think for me, the dyes being taken out of things, I like that. I have no problem with that. Because, you know, when you bake it at home yourself or when you make it at home, are you using those things? No, like you're not.
Exactly. And you think about the 10,000 chemicals that are in our foods that are not in, that have been banned in other countries for decades. Why is that okay? Or even in our own cosmetics, they put stuff in, and why? Is it necessary? And when you look at cookies, like you said, you make something at home, if you use sugar and flour and all of that, the product is still the baked product and tastes good. It just doesn't have the things that you wouldn't normally find in your kitchen, like sodium benzoate and some of these other things that keep the shelf life stable. And that's really the key here. And that's what we're talking about from an economic standpoint, is that those things are cheap to produce, they're cheap to put in, and they retain the shelf life because you don't want things to go bad on the shelf. And that's something that has to be balanced. But as we help people when they're trying to make informed decisions, does it take time to bake? Sure, it does. But if the product is more healthful because it doesn't contain so much preservative or dye, to your point, then who cares? It makes more sense. It's more logical.
And I think, we've talked about beauty and body image in this conversation a lot. And I'm just curious as to, if you could change one thing about the way that we define beauty in American society, what would it be?
As they used to say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I think it's whatever, you have to see people for people. This is a show. And that show will change with age. That show will change with a lot of people with accidents. We see a lot of people coming back from war-torn regions that have burns and so forth. They are still that person. They have a soul or a spirit or whatever you want to call it. I think we need to get away from more of the physicality, which does drive a lot of things. They talked about, good-looking people are more successful than those that are not. I will tell you, I looked at pictures of myself when I was like 11 or 12. I had a huge overbite, red hair, and I was not an attractive kid, and I got bullied. And people were like, well, you look different now. I said, yes, but I'm still that same person inside. And I was treated differently when I looked that way versus when I got a bit older. So I've seen both sides of that. And I think it makes people more aware of how their personality changes with time and how they should behave towards others. And, personality is pretty much set by the time you're 8. So I think about when you were 8 years old. And what influenced you to look a certain way, and maybe how we all treated people because of the way they, quote, looked. That is a normal tenet. But then you grow out of it and you start seeing people as people. For the most part, there's always going to be jerks. I'm sure we can think of the mean girls that we grew up with or the mean guys that we grew up with, and as adults, we see them again and are like, yep, personality was set at 8, they're still jerks. But you don't need to put up with that anymore. You have the ability to walk away from that. And I think in standards of beauty, we need to recognize that everybody is their own person that is the culmination of environment, genetics, and whatever these other traits are that affect them. And they should be respected as such. You may disagree, you may not get along for whatever reason, but they're still people. And we need to stop looking at trying to strive to be something that we're not, and whatever that is.
So if you ever had to go back in time and see how body image was portrayed, I'm sure you've read about it, but actually see it in practice, do you know where you would want to go?
I think it would be interesting, at least for me, to go back to the 1950s. And I'll tell you why. because we saw women like Marilyn Monroe and Jane Russell, and I know I'm going back, but they had voluptuous, womanly body shape. And today they would be considered fat. And I've heard that a lot. And the average beauty contestant back in those days was about 150 pounds and 5'8", and now 115 pounds and like 5'10". So that standard of beauty has changed. Why is skinnier better? And I have no idea, but that's just what's been promoted. Maybe it films better, I don't know. But these were attractive, confident women, at least on film, maybe not so much in their personal lives, but that's the way they portrayed themselves. I think we started seeing a shift in a lot of things right around the 1950s. And I mean that by women coming into their own, women becoming more independent. And if you look back in the 1970s, things change even further, where it was much more of it was sort of a dichotomy between a very casual atmosphere versus professional women, and it started melding together. We talked about a lot today. Thank you for having me on the show. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We'd like to give a huge thank you to Martina for helping us peel back the layers of diet culture, wellness trends, and the impact they have on our relationship with food and our bodies.
We hope this conversation helps you take a step back, question the norms, and begin to redefine what healthy truly means for you, free from the pressure to conform to society's standards and ideals.
To learn more about Martina's work and the topics we covered today, be sure to check out the episode's show notes. We'll have links to her website, several of her articles, and other valuable resources.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. You can find us on social media, X, Threads, Instagram, TikTok, and you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode. Thanks for listening.
Until next time.